discussed on this podcast are determined by the Justice Coordinating Commission of the Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. Guest opinions do not necessarily reflect those of the Sisters of Providence. To learn more, go to www.spsmw.org.
Welcome to Just Us, where we talk about creating an equitable human community and influencing change. Through shared stories, conversation, and inspiration, we will learn how we can make a difference in our communities. I'm Dr. Pearlette Springer, a Providence Associate with the Sisters of Providence at St. Mary the Woods in St. Mary the Woods, Indiana. If you are a new listener and have never visited St. Mary of the Woods, we are located west of Terre Haute, Indiana, on Route 150, approximately 4 miles east of the Illinois state line and about 80 miles west of downtown Indianapolis. Our guest today is Caitlin Morneau from the Catholic Mobilizing Network. We are here to discuss restorative justice and restorative practices. As always, we want to inspire you to take action for the common good. As Carrie Newcomer sings in her song, if not now, tell me when. Caitlin, welcome to Providence Community Just Us podcast, where we discuss all things that center around justice. Can you tell us a little about yourself?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And thank you so much for having me, Pearlette. Well, I am calling in from Washington, D.C., where I serve as Director of Restorative Justice at Catholic Mobilizing Network. And first, for listeners who don't know, Catholic Mobilizing Network is the national organization that mobilizes Catholics and all people of goodwill to end the death penalty, advance justice solutions that align with gospel values, and begin healing through restorative approaches and practices. And we do all this through education, advocacy, and prayer. Now, in terms of how I come to this ministry, I'm a cradle Catholic who was involved with service and ministry through my church from an early age, especially around hunger and homelessness. And this included a good deal of time in rural Appalachia with Catholic communities providing home repair services and sustainable agriculture. Later, I spent a year of service in Baltimore working as a caseworker in a homeless shelter for families. And that was really where I began to understand how cycles of poverty and homelessness were all knotted up with cycles of incarceration and unhealed trauma in the lives of the families and that I was walking with. I also remember both then as a young adult and even as a child asking myself and others questions about, how did locking someone up fix the damage of the crime that they committed? And not really getting a lot of answers. So later on, when I took a parish-based course on Catholic social teaching, I learned about restorative justice, and it was described to me as a response to harm and violence that seeks to heal and repair the people and relationships violated by crime. And this seemed so in line with the core values that I'd been taught, and it really ignited a real sense of purpose to grow awareness of this approach within the faith community that I've always called home. So for the past 8 years, alongside the tremendous team here at CMN, I've worked in collaboration with many to co-create resources and lead formation programs, host our Encounters with Dignity podcast, among other things. And amongst all of this, really, the thing that nourishes and compels my vocation most are the sacred relationships with people impacted by violence and incarceration and the death penalty, as well as ministers and advocates and practitioners who accompany them. These folks are really my greatest teachers.
Wow, you seem like you got your hands quite busy in the work of restoring relationships. Since our focus of our conversation is restorative justice, I would like to begin with a definition. Having a common definition helps everyone involved in the conversation and listeners too, at least begin on the same page. And when you were doing your introduction, you did allude to a definition, but at this time, can you really just give us a clear definition of what is generally accepted as the definition of restorative justice?
Sure. I'm so glad you asked because there really are many ways to describe restorative justice. So I'll offer you one description that we typically use here at CMN and then expand on it a little bit. So restorative justice broadly is a philosophy or an approach to justice in which crime and harm are understood in terms of the people and relationships impacted, rather than solely the law or the rule that was broken. Restorative practices are voluntary and safe processes that bring together those affected by harm. And these processes allow all participants to understand the impacts of that harmful action and what is needed to make things right. And in hearing about these definitions, what can be really helpful is to hear stories that help bring them to life. So one of the stories that I think of is of our friends, the Gromer and McBride families in Florida. It was about 15 years ago when Connor McBride shot his girlfriend, Anne Gromer, and she later died of her wounds. Anne's parents, Kate and Deacon Andy, who were moved to forgive Connor early on, successfully advocated for a restorative justice circle process to shape his sentencing because they wanted to have a say in that process. And in that circle process, each person got to fully explain what was happening for them at the time, Connor included, how they were impacted, and their desires for Connor, who now educates others on teen dating violence and dedicates his time to causes that Anne was passionate about while he serves time in prison. There are also programs across the country that facilitate such processes with young people as alternatives to incarceration. So to connect this with Catholic social teaching, I think it's always helpful to remember that the original meaning of justice is where we are in right relationship with God, one another, and all of God's creation. This teaching is grounded in a biblical concept of shalom, the state of living in harmony and peace and human flourishing. But harm and crime and oppression shatter this vision for wholeness. So restorative justice aims to repair relationships and create conditions for healing and transformation for all those impacted by harm, whether it was suffered, caused, or impacted.
I love the way you say that because it walks right into the next question I was going to ask you. Because 15 years ago was the first time I was introduced to restorative justice. And it was at a lecture series at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne, where, and I can't remember the name, but someone presented a lecture, so to speak, and they had the person that committed the crime and the victim who did most of the talking. Ever since then, I've wanted to learn more. And so in your explanation of the definition, you do mention death penalty, you mention crime, you mention victim, you mention harm, but you also went on to talk about restoring relationships. So I want to know if in the Catholic world, we have this sacrament that's not used much called reconciliation. And sometimes it's referred to as penance, which people think of as punishment. But without getting too much into the theology behind the sacrament of reconciliation, my thought has always been that we could use these rituals of reconciliation as a restorative practice. Are there ideas behind of using our sacrament of reconciliation, especially the rituals, that can be used to help restore relationships?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked because my son is actually about to participate in his first sacrament of reconciliation. So I've been thinking about this a lot. But before I go into that, there was another piece of this kind of understanding restorative justice that I know was really helpful in my own learning that I want to share with our listeners too. And that has to do with the questions that we ask. And so, because I think in a lot of ways, this kind of reconciling approach to justice makes a lot of sense to us as Christians in our tradition. But it can be a struggle to kind of put that alongside the way that the US criminal legal system operates. And it can be helpful then to think about how the differences in the questions that a legal approach asks and a restorative approach asks. So the US criminal legal system tends to ask three questions, primarily what law was broken, who's guilty, and what should their punishment be. A restorative approach tends to ask different questions, primarily what was the harm, who was impacted and how, and what needs to be done to make things right. And so just to expand on those a little bit, in a legal system approach, punishment and incarceration are often seen as the only means of accountability. Victims' needs for healing often and safety often go unmet. Families and communities get fractured and divided. Racial disparities are blatant, and punitive responses often fuel cycles of violence. Whereas in a restorative approach, and again, those questions are what was the harm, who was impacted and how, and what needs to make things right. This approach understands accountability in terms of taking responsibility for our actions and their impacts. It puts the experience and needs of the victim or survivor at the center of the process. It gives community members a voice and a role and really prioritizes reintegration of all involved. Restorative justice also seeks to address root causes of crime, including systemic racism. And it recognizes that hurt people hurt people. So, what some folks might describe as the offender or the person responsible also has needs for healing. And this can help actually break cycles of violence. So, if we then kind of think about this in the context of the sacrament of reconciliation, so when I was at my son's retreat in preparation for his sacrament of reconciliation, the director of religious ed did a really lovely job of describing how sin gets in the way of our relationship with God and how going to confession is how we restore our friendship with God, how we come in back into right relationship with God. As I think about the ways that restorative practices help us come back into right relationship with people in our lives when harm has happened. Now, it's probably not so difficult to see how confession of wrongdoing and acts of making amends or repair are present in both the sacrament of reconciliation and restorative practices or a restorative dialogue. Another piece that I think is so important for both, though, is the element of self-reflection. So before entering the confessional, we spend time in an examination of conscience, of our actions and their impacts. And what's really important for folks to know and understand is that, especially when grave or complex harm has happened, that significant time in restorative practices is dedicated to individual preparation before anyone gathers in a dialogue. And this self-reflection is really essential to readiness and for a fruitful encounter of coming together. And, I think another important through line to highlight is that of forgiveness. And the grace of the sacrament is that God's forgiveness is boundless and so available to us. The Catholic tradition recognizes that human forgiveness after harm is never an obligation, but is a creative act of invitation and possibility and grace. And we here at CMN recognize that the journey of forgiving is unique for each individual in their own place and way and time. And so restorative justice processes don't expect or require specific expressions of forgiveness. Rather, by tending to the impacts of harm in solidarity with one another, they become vessels for God's mercy and grace to shape the labor of justice itself. And I love what Pope Francis says in Fratelli Tutti. He says that forgiveness is precisely what enables us to pursue justice without falling into a spiral of revenge or the injustice of forgetting. And so, as Catholics, I think our practice of the sacrament of reconciliation prepares our hearts for restorative encounters in our everyday relationships and the faith-filled pursuit of justice.
And I would agree with you 100% there. And while you were talking, what came back to this memory came back of when years ago I hosted, I said I hosted, I didn't host, I planned it because a youth event. I don't do kids. I've never done kids, even though I raised a child. My son will tell you I don't do kids. And so, but I did plan the whole event, and it was aimed for middle school and high school youth. And a part of that event was the sacrament of reconciliation. And most of the kids that participated were non-Catholic, and I would say probably a third of them were never been baptized, never been inside a church, the whole 9 yards. And so one of the priests that I invited to be part of this, he was very hesitant about the sacrament of reconciliation. They're not Catholic. They won't understand, blah, 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 And so when it came time to do so, he didn't want to look bad in front of his brother priests. And so he fully participated. And what was amazing afterwards was how he felt, the transformation in him by talking to these young, mostly Black males, and this was a white priest, talking to these young Black males about the harm they had caused to other people. And these were just average teenagers. These were not people that were out doing crime. These were just average teenagers. So a lot of the harm they talked about was harm they did to their siblings or harm they did to their parents, what they even considered harm. And then afterwards, well, even before they actually sat down and talked to a priest one-on-one, they had to list the harm they done. And you're much younger than I am. You don't remember when we had to sit outside of the confessional and we had to make a list before we went in. And the sisters, when I was in elementary school, the sisters would actually look at your list to make sure you included everything. So I know that kind of changed now. But anyway, I had these youth make a list. And then after they talked to the priest, we went outside, we lit a big fire, and they got to put that piece of paper in the fire. And we did a ritual where, and I can't think of the psalm we used, the one to talk about it rises up, the ashes rises up, something, I forget what psalm it was. And it reaches God, And so I still remember that to this day. And it has to be about 20 years ago. But every time I think about it, I see how what I planned, which was something I've never planned before, didn't know how people were going to respond. And it was so positive. And the reaction of that priest, who him and I were not good friends anyway, but to see the way he reacted and how it transformed him and how after that day, he engaged with the youth a little bit different, a little bit more open. And That's my vision of restorative relationship, restorative justice. So I'm not a practitioner. I believe in restorative justice. I believe in restorative practice. And my goal in any type of relationship is to have a good relationship. And as far back as I can remember, if I caused harm or if I feel like I caused harm, I've always gone back and apologized and reapproached that. Can restorative practice be used in general versus just an extension of prison ministry? And if so, how?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked because restorative approaches can really apply in so many areas of our lives. And first, I want to deeply appreciate our colleagues and listeners who have been directly accompanying people who are incarcerated. I think especially of your own sister, Barbara Batista, who has walked with so many men on federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana. And, I also think of, say, our friend Felix Rosado, who more than a decade into his incarceration, he read a book about people who had lost loved ones to murder and recognized how he had caused a family the same harm. And at that same time, he was reconnecting with his faith and started going to mass again and ended up creating this incredibly transformative restorative justice program inside of prison where, along with his incarcerated brothers, they worked to take responsibility for their actions and explore and heal from some of their own traumas and repair relationships with their families and loved ones. I actually got to visit one of their workshops inside of Graterford State Prison, and it was just incredible. So, this is just another example of what restorative practices can look like inside of prison. But just to acknowledge that, as you have already, that restorative practices can happen in many ways, and harm takes many forms. It's not only criminal in nature, but all of us can think of times when we've been hurt or caused hurt with someone in our family or our workplace or our neighborhood. And so restorative practices can help us bring these questions of, what happened, what needs were created, what are my obligations to make things right in these hurting places. They can also help us to prevent harm through deep listening and sharing. We can build trust and connection and community in ways that help us honor one another's dignity, even when we disagree, that help us navigate conflict and when necessary, repair harm more easily when it does happen. And these approaches are really impactful in a lot of places, including our own parish lives. At Catholic Mobilizing Network, we offer a training called Conversations in Communion, Parish Dialogues for Connection and Understanding. And it's a formation program that equips Catholics to introduce the restorative practice of circle process in their ministries. And circle process is a restorative practice that's informed by Native and Indigenous peacemaking traditions. It's also very resonant with spiritual practices found in Christian communities, especially small group sharing and deep listening and communal discernment. And in circle process, we open and close with prayer or ceremony. We create agreed and agree upon guidelines. And then when responding to prompts from a facilitator, we pass a talking piece to signal the speaker, which ensures that every person has the opportunity to share without interruption. And so this really helps us to slow down the conversation and acknowledge one another's dignity through storytelling that helps to build trust and potentially undertake difficult conversations in ways that may help build bridges in surprising ways. And so this is just one opportunity for folks to kind of step into the invitation to restorative justice and restorative practices, in addition to kind of bringing this mindset and approach into everyday life.
So if we put all this into practice, I think we could bring about social change as we are hoping and praying for. As I always say, it is all about relationships with each other, relationship with creation, and relationship with our creator. I just have one more question, and this question is, how can our listeners and me too become a restorative justice practitioner?
What a wonderful question. And if you'll indulge me, I will share a few resources from CMN to help accompany folks on the journey. You can First, you can just keep learning broadly. There are a lot of great resources and texts out there. And I encourage you to attend one of Catholic Mobilizing Network's Intro to Restorative Justice workshops, where you get to hear directly from someone who's participated in a restorative justice process, and you get to experience a mini circle process, which is a really lovely experience. On a different, It's also important to note that there are different kinds of facilitators needed for different types of restorative practices. So for a person to facilitate a harm repair dialogue, really specific training and mentorship is needed. So if that's something that your listeners are interested in, you can get in touch with me at CMN and we can help connect you with programs or organizations in your area that offer this kind of training and accompaniment. But if you're someone who leads small groups in your parish or ministry, we would love to have you in one of our upcoming conversations and communion trainings. And you can find all this information on our website. You can download the facilitator guide there, and you can also find dates for our upcoming virtual trainings, which are offered monthly, and we'd love to see you there.
Caitlin, can you share your website address, please?
Yes, our website is catholicsmobilizing.org. And if you go to upcoming events, you will find both forthcoming Intro to Restorative Justice workshops and conversations and communion trainings coming up.
Thank you, Caitlin. I am so glad that you brought up Sister Barbara Batista, because as soon as you said her name, I remember her saying, make sure she talks about restorative circles, which you did. So I could feel good that when she listened to this podcast, she will hear you talk about restorative circles. But thanks so much, Caitlin. It has been such a pleasure and honor talking with you today. Godspeed on your journey to Catholic Mobilizing Network, and may the Holy Spirit continue to inspire you in the work of love, mercy, and justice. And thank you, Just Us listeners, for taking the time to share the space with us today. We hope that you have been inspired by a conversation and learned a little bit about restorative justice and how to be a restorative justice practitioner. Are you now ready to begin making a difference within your community, within your family, within your own circle of friends? If not now, tell me when. This episode has been brought to you by the Providence community at St. Mary of the Woods. The producers of this podcast are Associates of Providence, Jane Fisher and Susie Ray, and the Sisters of Providence, Emily DeCoste and Barbara Batista. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and will share it with others in your network of friends, family, and community. Feel free to leave any comments, reviews, and suggestions for future topics at spsmw.org/contact. spsmw.org/contact. Thank you for listening. Talk to you soon.